there was a time in this country until very recently when the argument that Israel shouldn't exist simply wasn't sounded in polite society. That was a case that the Jewish community had made beginning in the 1950s and fell on willing ears. And in fact, there's a tradition in America going back to the 1700s, very strong in the 1800s, of philo-Semitism. John Adams supported the return of the Jews to their own land. There was one of the first major Jewish politicians in America, Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who was the sheriff of New York and an ambassador to Turkey, to Morocco, founded his own Jewish state in an island in the Niagara Falls. And so there was an acceptance of the Jewish narrative of Jews and Judaism in America going way, way back. So the taboo... And Zionism. So the taboo on attacking the credibility and legitimacy of Jewish claims goes way back. That taboo, I believe, is falling, and it is now acceptable in polite society, in political culture, and intellectual society to question the legitimacy of the Jewish claim. So that the acceptance of the Jewish claim and of Israel may be as high, but those people who accept the Jewish claim don't necessarily regard the opposing claim as illegitimate. Now, I don't regard the opposing claim as illegitimate either, but I think it's good for Israel. We're talking politics here, we're not talking right and wrong. It's good for Israel when its claim is regarded as higher by the superpower, because then it gets a better deal going into the negotiating room. And that's the main advantage. If you don't go into the negotiating room because you think you've got all the time in the world, your advantage dissipates.
Do you see the Palestinian claims being used as a tool to feed anti-Semitism?
I think it's the reverse. I think resentment of the Jewish community grows as it stands up and resists any legitimacy to the Palestinian claims. That is to say, as visible representatives of the Jewish community, who don't necessarily represent Jewish opinion, speak out in the name of the Jewish community and present a hard line and a hostility toward Palestinian claims, there is a resentment of the Jewish community. Now remember, we have been saying for generations, we are one. An attack on Israel is an attack on us. They've taken that as a basic Torah of the Jewish community. And now Palestinians are saying, okay, if it's an attack on you, why not? They were willing in 2002, and in fact in 1996, to blow up a bus in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Haifa and kill people who had nothing, who weren't soldiers. They were simply the back, the Oref, the home guard, the rear guard, the supporters. If you're willing to go to Haifa and kill school children, why wouldn't you do it in the Bronx?
Am I understanding you're saying that the anti-Semitism is manifesting as a result of the Jews' unwillingness to acknowledge the Palestinian narrative?
I'm saying that there is a hostility toward the Jewish community. There are Jews who are involved in this, and they're not stigmatized. Noam Chomsky is well accepted on the left. It's not a hostility toward Jews, it's a hostility toward the Jewish community as an organization, as an institution. We don't remember, we forget that we are an entity, that when the ADL or the President's Conference or AIPAC acts, they're acting in our name. In the same way that we are not responsible when a movie studio makes a racist movie, because we didn't choose them. We are responsible when AIPAC acts because we support them. When you pay a UJA pledge, when you go to a synagogue whose president goes to the convention and elects the president. The President's Conference is elected by us. Most people don't pay any attention to it. The United Synagogue has a convention every year. The presidents of all the synagogues go to it. They choose a president, and he sits on the Conference of Presidents of Jewish Organizations. And there's 50 other organizations that work the same way. They have members, they elect, they have a convention. In 1993, I guess, before the Oslo Accord was signed, but after Rabin was elected, Peace Now asked to join the President's Conference. They said, we are taking the line that Rabin's government takes, why shouldn't we be part of the mainstream Jewish community? They were going to lose. There was an enormous hostility toward them because they were friendly to the Palestinian narrative. what they did, and it's never been done before or since, they got their members, who are members of other organizations. If you're in Peace Now in Hadassah, call the president of Hadassah. Tell them how you want them to vote. It had never happened before. Hundreds or thousands of people called up the presidents of the organizations they were members of and said, here's what I want to happen. And they won. They turned the vote around because they called their representatives. It's the same thing we do in Congress, but we never think of it in the Jewish community because we don't think of ourselves as part of a functioning political entity. And we are. And when that political entity creates enemies, as all political entities do, you fight with somebody, you get on their wrong side. We didn't like Russia. We didn't like France for many years. The Jewish community is now in a conflict with the Muslim community in this country and with the left. And you got to deal with it. We're part of it. We did elect those people.
How good a job do you think the Jewish establishment is doing, and I'll point out the ADL or the Wiesenthal Center, in fighting anti-Semitism that's been fomented as a result of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
I think they're doing a lousy job. I think it begins with the fact that they don't accept the very idea that hostility toward Jews could ever be a consequence of Jewish action. If you express hostility toward Jews, you have a psychological problem. Now, this was a bunch of studies done in the 1950s by some of the greatest psychologists in the world, funded by the American Jewish Committee. It's called the Frankfurt School, and they came up with the doctrine that prejudice is a mental disorder and should be treated as simply crazy. The idea that a group could be disliked because it did something, we don't get it. And we don't think of the Jews as a group that does anything. We have gotten used to, when I wrote Jewish Power in 1996, people thought it was an anti-Semitic book. The Jewish community does things that affect others? How dare you? But obviously we do.
But the anti-Semitism records last year that occurred during Operation Cast Lead, Israel's defensive action in Gaza, for instance, anti-Semitism manifested throughout the Western world. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Not as a result of what the Jewish community did to disregard the validity of Arab or Islamic or Palestinian claims.
There was an enormous resentment of Cast Lead, and there was an enormous resentment of Israel and its allies. Remember, during the Bush years, America was hated. The polls showed up until 2004 that Bush was incredibly unpopular, but America was still regarded as a shining city on a hill. After the Americans re-elected Bush into 2004, hostility toward America shot up because people aren't stupid, and now it's no longer not your fault. So it's hostility toward a country, not because of a mental disorder, but because of resentment of things it actually does and says. And resentment toward Israel grew after the action in Gaza, which was regarded, rightly or wrongly, as a massacre.
Would you say the ADL has created a permissive climate to allow for the fomenting of anti-Semitic attitudes?
Not at all. I think they're fighting yesterday's battle, but that doesn't mean they're fighting. They're not fighting. To accuse people of anti-Semitism is no longer an effective tool. Look, when not Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, don't even remember his name.
Khalidi?
No, it was a leader of the Nation of Islam who gave a speech at a college in New Jersey in the 90s, and it was a wildly anti-Semitic rant, and the ADL took out a full-page ad in the New York Times and reprinted the speech. And there was an enormous reaction against the Nation of Islam. And the ADL was attacked for attacking the Nation of Islam. All they did was print the speech. People read what he had said and they were revolted. Nowadays, you accuse somebody of anti-Semitism, print their speech, oh, the Jewish community got us into Iraq, or oh, the Jewish community supports Israel. And people don't like that, and it's not a lie. It's a consequence of our actions. I'm not saying that good old anti-Semitism, irrational hatred of Jews killing Jesus or being chiselers or whatever, is gone. It's still there. But the most active anti-Semitism that we see is from enemies of Israel, not traditional Christians who hate. I mean, Mel Gibson is the exception, but there's a lot of exceptions. There's still right-wing there was a wave during the 90s and early 2000s of racist lunatics. There was one in Los Angeles who went on a rampage. He shot up the JCC in the Valley, and then he went and shot a black person, an Asian. There was a guy in Chicago I think the same year or a year afterwards, who went and shot up a synagogue in Skokie and then went and killed a couple of black people and an Asian. There was a group in Sacramento that planned to blow up a synagogue, and they killed a black guy. In other words, it was attacks on blacks, Jews, and Asians systematically, one time after another. America has local press. We don't really have a national press. So, except for the very big stories out of Washington, things like that don't get covered. So there was a trend that nobody ever noticed. There was the guy who was shot the abortion doctor in Buffalo in 1998. Jewish guy, he had just come home. I mean, the doctor was a Jew who had just come home from synagogue on Friday night, and he was shot in the kitchen with his coat still on. The killer, it turned out, had been killing abortion doctors every year on what in Canada is called the Unborn Memorial Day, I think, November 11th. It's the end of the Veterans Day. They made that their holiday for remembering the unborn, and every year, within a week of that day, he would kill another abortion doctor with a Jewish name. One of them wasn't Jewish, but had a German name. The others were Jewish. Nobody ever made a big deal out of the Jewish part because, as I say, it was scattered. So we don't notice these things. Yes, there has been a wave of killing. There's also been dozens of Arab and Muslim terrorists in this country since the mid-1990s shooting and killing either Jews, people they think are Jews, like the El Al desk at LAX, the roof of the Empire State Building, the CIA parking lot, a train in Brooklyn that goes through Borough Park through the Orthodox section, and they caught them before they blew the place up. It was going to be a subway car with hundreds of people on it. So there are these two separate patterns of anti-Semitism. One of them is classic irrationality or prejudice, and the other is opposition to the state of Israel.
And how well do you think those donors who donate to the ADL and Wiesenthal, what kind of value are they getting for their donations in terms of thwarting and trying to control the acceptability and manifestations of anti-Semitism in modern-day Western society?
I've never heard of anybody who was remotely likely to donate to the ADL or the Simon Wiesenthal Center thinking that a mistake had been made in failing to notice. In other words, the notion that Jews could not be guilty of anything and that any attack on Jews is automatically illegitimate, and that preventing anti-Semitism by changing your behavior, these are regarded as absolutely off the map, out of the question by most donors. So that the ADL often gets accused of not fighting anti-Semitism because it makes moves in the direction of moderation. It was the ADL that made up with Jesse Jackson. It was the ADL that made up with Pat Robertson when he wrote a letter of apology for having offended the Jewish community with Jesus killing stuff. The ADL accepts apologies. The ADL works with other groups to reduce prejudice. Now, they don't accept openly the notion that anti-Semitism can be a response to Jewish behavior. They don't accept that. And yet they do act to lower the level of prejudice, and they get attacked by the Jewish right all the time. There's campaigns to replace them, to get Foxman fired, because they are too moderate. I don't think anybody is attacking them for failing to get at the root of anti-Semitism. They're failing them for, you see what I'm saying?
To what extent do you believe that the Palestinian news, like the Mohammed al-Dur affair, has been fabricated and essentially set up since Arafat to victimize Palestinians, to vilify Israelis?
Both the Palestinians and the Israelis have a case to make. They regard themselves, both sides, as in a fight to the death. The Palestinians, look, our government was paying people to blow up schools and clinics in Nicaragua in the 1980s. They were freedom fighters. In the late 80s, 1988, the Bush administration, 1989 or 1990 actually, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, was in a very tense negotiation with Israel about getting talks started with the Palestinians. And James Baker came out with all sorts of hardline, Israel has to wake up, Israel has to this, there's 5 conditions that must be met. Shamir, the prime minister, who had been the head of the Stern Gang in the 1940s before Israel, spoke to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and he said, we must stop attacking the PLO as a terrorist organization. Attack them for wanting our land. Attack them for killing our children, but don't call them a terrorist organization because we were terrorists. It was in the Jerusalem Post. It's never been reprinted. There's a lot of things that just don't get reset.
What about factual errors, factual Palestinian propaganda, essentially, when photographs and videos are set up?
I don't think the photograph of Mohammed al-Dura was deliberately fabricated. I think people saw the kid dying, assumed that it was the other side, would not have believed the Israeli case, and a lot of people still don't believe it because they're so angry, and you could say hateful, toward Israel. There are people in Israel who don't believe that the Palestinians are sincere about peace because they keep on hearing all they want to do is kill us. It's in the Arab nature to hate Jews. I would call that fabricated propaganda. Now, who's more guilty? Probably the Palestinians. I accept that. Look, Israel's my side. It's my guys. It's my nephews who are in the army. So yeah, when the bullets fall, I'm on my side. But playing fast and loose with the truth is part of politics. I was the maskir of a kibbutz. I was the secretary of a kibbutz for a year. And I discovered very quickly, you cannot run a community if you tell the truth all the time. It doesn't work. You want to do something, these people want it X and these people want it Y. You know it's got to be Z. You know they're going to hate it until it happens, and then they'll be fine. So you tell, okay, I'm going to give you X, I'm going to give you Y. You do Z, and everybody's happy. But you didn't tell the truth. You can't tell the truth all the time. It's silly. It's not real politics to expect that sort of behavior. So, yeah, they lie. They're engaged in a war.
But do you believe that the war is purely about where the boundaries are drawn, or do you believe that there's an Islamist, a global movement to spread Islam, including recapturing historic Muslim lands?
There is definitely an Islamic, it's a doctrine of Islamic faith, that land that becomes Muslim, Islamic, must remain Muslim or Islamic. But they got used to Spain. Osama bin Laden wants Spain back. There is a movement in Islam of radical extremism that wants to roll back history. But it's not synonymous with Palestinian nationalism. It's not. In fact, Hamas doesn't want Spain back. They want Palestine. And it's a mixture of nationalism and religion. Jews, Israel would have peace probably right now if it had been able to make the concessions that are being asked in return for Palestinian concessions, if it didn't have settlers who believed the whole land for religious reasons should be Israel's. Gush Emunim started right after the Six-Day War because God had miraculously saved Israel from destruction. It was a sign that the Messiah is on the way, and they read in the book of Psalms that when you move forward, you advance God's glory, and when you move backwards, God punishes you. And if they move the borders of Israel from the Jordan River back to the hills, God will punish them. So they're fighting to save, out of religious passion. They're a minority, as the radical Islamists are in the Arab world. People who are moderates feel uncomfortable attacking their own guys, just as Arabs feel uncomfortable attacking Islamists. And so we're in this cycle where people listen to their most extreme relatives. You always look over your right shoulder to see if you're doing the right thing. Reform Jews look over at the conservatives look at the Orthodox, and the Orthodox look at the ultras. It's the way identity works. And so, yeah, now, we're fighting, ultimately, if it can be solved politically, because the majority of, Hamas won an election in 2006, was it? With 44% of the vote. Fatah ran a bunch of candidates because they were undisciplined. And so in many of the districts, Hamas won with 44%. That was their overall popular vote. It is universally accepted that many of the people who voted for Hamas were voting against Fatah corruption and not for Hamas's plan to destroy Israel. So support for among Palestinians for destroying Israel and for fighting until that happens is 20%, 30%. Support in Israel for never giving back the West Bank, for keeping the settlements, for never dividing Jerusalem. For never giving back the settlements, probably 20%. For never dividing Jerusalem, 51, 52%. So there is a problem on both sides. And we point to the problem on their side because we want them to look bad. And we're very alarmed at how much credibility they are gaining in the minds of presumably good-hearted people in Europe and even America. So we fight hard and we tighten it. The story becomes out more extreme.
But do you see the Palestinian struggle as a manifestation of a larger Islamist movement to vilify Israel?
No. There is a large Islamist movement that is hitchhiking. Osama bin Laden formed his organization in the early 90s. Had nothing to say about Israel. He wanted to purify the Arab regimes that were cooperating with the West, with the Christians, with the Crusaders. In 1998, he merged his organization with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, a more extreme offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which wanted the same worldwide jihad. And in 1998, they issued a new statement of principles, which included driving the Zionists out of Palestine. By the way, it was number 3 of their list of 3 goals. So he hitchhiked on the Palestinian problem in order to gain support. Many Arabs are angry that the Arab world has been humiliated. But Sadat after Oslo in 1993, Israel opened up low-level diplomatic relations, interest office or trade offices in 7 Arab countries. And of the 22 members of the Arab League, there were 3 that had no relations with Israel. Up until 1993, most Arab countries wouldn't sit in the same room. They wouldn't go to a conference. They wouldn't sit next to Israel. After 1993, there were ongoing meetings between Israeli ambassadors and ambassadors. That's diplomatic relations at the lowest possible level. Meetings between your ambassadors with all but 3 of the Arab countries. So it goes up and down. It, just like anti-Semitism, just like Jewish fear, rises and falls in response to events. And for the large, as I said, after 1973 really, when America boosted its aid to the Arabs, to Israel, to $3 billion, or $2.5 billion originally, the Arab world has been in a gradual state of withdrawal. By 1982, they had universally said, no peace with Israel as long as it doesn't solve the Palestinian problem, which is not the same thing as no peace with Israel. The PLO was saying, we want all of Israel back. In 1974, after the Yom Kippur War, when Israel bloodied the Arab world and America jacked up in December of, no, it was in October, in the middle of the war, America announced $2.2 billion. In February, the PLO National Assembly, the Palestine National Council, met and adopted a plan for reconquering Palestine in stages and acting on a dual track of violence, armed struggle, they called it, and diplomacy. The Palestine Charter says the path to liberate Palestine is only through armed struggle. Palestine is indivisible. It says Palestine is indivisible twice. So to say that we will accept a division, even temporarily, is an abrogation of the covenant. It was, and by the way, it was the act of the junior partner in the governing coalition. Fatah's junior partner in the PLO was the Democratic Front, radical Marxist group, which had announced in 1970 that Israel had a right to exist.
So how can peace be made then with a charter that calls for the recapturing of all of former Palestine?
Well, if they think their charter is so malleable that they can drop it, if they decided, I think in 1993, Arafat announced that the charter was, I think in French, caduc, dead. There's an effort by people who don't want to give up anything on the Israeli side to make it look like the Arabs will never accept Israel. Now, the Arab League unanimously adopted in 2002 a program saying Israel may be accepted, we may open diplomatic relations if Israel makes the deal with the Palestinians. And the deal with the Palestinians was already written down. Neither side had officially endorsed it, but there was a deal. They know where they're going. They said officially, now in the 70s when they used to say Israel must be wiped off the map, we said listen to them. They say they want to destroy Israel. They don't play around with words. Arabic is a very precise language. In the 1990s and the 2000s, when they say we accept Israel, we say they're just lying. Arabic is a very loose language. Well, which is it?
But Hamas has never dropped their intention to capture it, and isn't the West Bank in danger of being conquered by Hamas once Fatah, let's say, cuts a deal?
Well, the longer Israel goes on, look, right now Israel's cooperating with Fatah. Fatah's program has been get a Palestinian state on part of the land. Hamas rejects that and they're fighting with each other. Fatah is at a disadvantage in the population, partly because they don't get anything. Hamas, through armed struggle, got Gaza. The PLO, through negotiations, got roadblocks all over the place, settlements continuing to eat into privately owned Palestinian farms, the segregated roads. It takes you a 15-minute drive to the doctor, now takes 2 hours because you have to go around roadblocks and the fence and all these other things. So they don't get anything. They look like fools. Israel makes the PLO look like fools. Israel says we will never give you anything in response to terror, but the only people who get anything are the terrorists. Israel frees prisoners to get its own prisoners out. Fatah captures and kills prisoners. They get prisoners out. I mean, the Hamas. So if you want Fatah to succeed, then yes, work with them, make deals, give in response to taking. And if you believe Hamas proves, unlike Fatah, that there's a resistance, then you've just stated, yeah, the majority wants to make a deal, have two states alongside each other, because that's what Fatah does. And then a minute later, we turn around and we say, but Fatah doesn't really accept Israel. So we say whatever works, just like the Arabs do, in order to make our case and make it impossible to make the deal, because we don't want to pull out, because God will punish us. Now, you don't hear Gush Emunim going around saying, God will punish us if we pull out. It doesn't sell. They haven't stated that publicly. They state it in some of their inner communications. They say different things in Hebrew than they say in English, just like the Arabs do in Arabic. In English, they say, oh, Israel's security will be threatened. You can shoot from the mountaintops, and they'll control the hills over Ben Gurion Airport, and this and that, and what about our water, and all these other things, which the army doesn't buy. That's not Israeli policy. That's not Israeli defense strategy. Israeli defense strategy is the safest way to keep Israel safe is to have a border. Put them there and us here, because they don't like us. If you really believe they hate you, why do you want to live next door to them?
But do you believe that they genuinely want a Jewish neighbor state with autonomy living next door on lands that they think are their holy lands?
Of course they don't want it any more than Jews want to give up Hebron or Shiloh. But that's the best they're going to get. In the Geneva negotiations, Yossi Beilin, that informal, the radical thing that took place, they came up with this two-state solution that Israel gives up half of Jerusalem and so on. Yossi Beilin was leading the Israeli delegation. The Palestinian delegation, by the way, was led by officials of the PLO. So the Israeli left, former government, was accepting something that the PLO formally accepted. One day, over lunch, with Kadora Fares, who was a senior aide to Marwan Barghouti, the guy who's in jail, considered the most popular leader of Fatah. And Yossi said to Kadora Fares, I don't understand why you're here. If you sit on your hands in 10 years, you will be a majority. There will be more Arabs than Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and then you just have to say, okay, one man, one vote, and it's yours. Why are you here? Why bother taking 22%? And Fares said, if we sit on our hands for 20 years, we will be a majority, and in another 100 years of struggle, we will have our own state. But I have kids. and I don't want my kids to grow up like this. I want a deal now so that they can have a life. That's what he said.
And do you believe that the Hamas and Fatah leadership genuinely want a state?
Want a Palestinian state? I think Hamas does. I think Hamas, look, I believe that they mean what they say. Fatah wants a state alongside Israel because they think that's the best the Palestinians will get. Hamas, like so many other religious extremists, is willing to fight and die to the last of their next door neighbor's blood to get the entirety of their dream.
Which is to conquer Israel.
It is to have a unified Arab world living under Islam. Yeah, that's what religious extremists want. The Christian right wants a Jewish, an all-Christian world so that Jesus will return. I'm not interested. What power do they have? And it's reality. It's politics that we're talking about. So if Hamas wants all of Palestine back, what do you do about it? How do you get to a state where there isn't war anymore? How do you put Fatah in charge? How do you get them to crush? Look, how do you get the settlers to agree to withdraw to a border so there can be a border? I remember my brother-in-law, who's a rabbi in Hebron. Yes. We're arguing over this is before they started the fence, when the left was in favor of the fence. And the right was saying, no, it'll be a border. We don't want a border between Israel and the West Bank. The West Bank is our heartland, it's our homeland. And I was saying, yeah, but you need at least a defensive way to keep, right now, somebody can walk from Ramallah to Tel Aviv, to Netanya, with a bomb strapped around their waist and nothing's in their way. It's a 3-hour hike. It's an open invitation. It's amazing that there isn't more terrorism. The wall went up and terrorism pretty much stopped because they can't get there anymore. He was against the wall. Most settlements don't have fences because they don't want a fence, because they want to show God that they're not afraid. They talk about how the Israelis in the early days, the kibbutzim didn't evacuate. And so we're here with our children raising but the kibbutzim sent the children to Tel Aviv. Did you see Exodus? The kids are packed off to Tel Aviv. They're not raising their children in a shooting gallery. My sister-in-law is raising her children in a shooting gallery. I love her very much. I love her kids. But I think they're mistaken. I think they have too much faith in God. You know the story about the guy who's standing on the rooftop, it's flooding, like New Orleans or something like that? He says, oh, God, save me. The water's rising. It's up to his knees. He says, God, save me. A boat comes by, a rowboat. He says, you want to ride? He says, no, God's going to save me. I have great faith. Water's up to his neck. A helicopter comes by. You want to ride? He says, no, I believe in God. I'm praying to him with all sincerity, and he's going to save me. Water rises over his head. He drowns. He goes to heaven. He says, why didn't you save me? God says, what do you want? I sent you a rowboat. I sent you a helicopter. I saw your face. I got to go.